You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansandsociety.org.uk/pm.
Hello and welcome to Parliament Matters Explains, a new bonus feature from the Parliament Matters podcast. I'm Mark Darcy.
And I'm Ruth Fox.
In these editions, we'll be focusing on issues raised by you, the listeners. So send us your questions at hansandsociety.org.uk/PMUQ. This time, our subject is, what do MPs actually do? Take it away, Ruth.
Well, Mark, we've had quite a few questions from our listeners about exactly what is it that MPs do. And short answer is they're not like the rest of us, generally speaking, because they don't have a job description. So there's no sort of specifically defined tasks that they must do. You can look at, breaking it down. They've got their parliamentary responsibilities, so they've got responsibility for scrutinising legislation. They've got responsibility for scrutinising public finances, scrutinising policy. Of course, if they become a minister, then they'll have departmental responsibilities within government. And of course, then they've got their constituency responsibilities, which is a growing aspect, has been for decades, but even more so since the pandemic, a growing aspect of their workload, performing some of the functions almost like a social worker. We're dealing with, very, very local problems of their constituents, whether it's housing, whether it's, problems with the local authority or another body that they've come up against, sort of an organ of the state where there's a lot of bureaucracy they're trying to fight through. Sorting out pensions and benefits, immigration questions. And then, of course, they've got a party role. So they've got a party political role as a representative of their respective party in the community, and sometimes with wider regional or national responsibilities.
Yeah, my short answer to the question, what do MPs do, is what they want, essentially, because a Member of Parliament has to choose the balance that they strike between all those different things. If you're a new MP, you may be very much on your mettle in the constituency, putting yourself about and devote more time to that. If you're a new MP with a very large majority who's perhaps not unduly worried about what their constituency thinks, you may be in the chamber the whole time asking questions and making life difficult for ministers or the opposition and making endless speeches on debates in random parliamentary occasions. So the constraints on that are very much from their own party. The whips might come to a particular MP and say, we'd like you to be on the bill committee that's going through the detail of this particular new piece of legislation, and then you'll find yourself spending day after day, potentially, in a Commons committee room, and they can often be either subtropical or absolutely freezing, depending on the weather. But you can be in that committee room going through the process of what is slightly fictionally referred to as line-by-line scrutiny. One of the slightly difficult things about that is if you've been into one of these committees, you sometimes notice that a lot of MPs are going through their constituency paperwork while just sort of making up the numbers on a committee and occasionally sticking up their hands to vote on cue when their party whips tell them to. But what I'm working round to here is a lot of the time the parliamentary duties that an individual MP takes on are directed to them by the party whips. Now, I suppose it's possible for an MP to say, no, I'm not doing that, but there may be sort of disciplinary consequences. And also sometimes the party whips can make you suffer if you fail to do their bidding by putting you on particularly boring bill committees that involve an awful lot of work. So that's I think probably the main constraint on an individual MP is just doing what their party tells them to, or being a spokesperson for their party perhaps, or a shadow minister, or even a prime minister making you a minister is the other way that those kind of duties can change.
Yeah, and that's why it varies from individual to individual. And that's, it also, you've got to think about an MP in London has a rather different life, both in terms of their work-life balance to the MP in the north of Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, for example.
Yeah, if you're Angus MacNeil, the MP for the Western Isles at the moment, you can find an awful lot of travelling, much greater than if you're the MP for the city in Westminster.
Yeah, so, the amount of time that they can devote to certain things and how they balance out that constituency and parliamentary work is necessarily very, very different.
And indeed, you can often find an individual MP ends up going to the whip saying, I think I'm under pressure in my constituency, I've got to spend more time there, can you not impose on me vast time-consuming duties elsewhere so that I can go and fight for my survival back home.
Yeah, and that's what you're seeing already. How far out are we from an election? It depends who you ask. A year out, possibly less. But we're already seeing MPs, even in not so marginal constituencies, wanting to be on the ground, fighting, doing the local campaigning, very high local presence in terms of visits to community events, lots of MPs visiting local schools, churches.
Opening envelopes.
There'll be an awful lot, they'll be out, a lot of them this Christmas will be out in A&E departments, they'll be out with the emergency services over the Christmas period. That's quite a common thing that they will do to see sort of life on the front line over the festive period.
I know one particular MP once told me the story that they had a young child, and that young child was born early in November, and that young child, for I think the first 6 or 7 years of their life, spent every birthday weekend going around mining villages to a succession of different remembrance services, because the MP had to be there. Yeah. And that's the kind of way that constituency life can intrude into your parliamentary duties.
And it used to be the case that constituency work was focused primarily Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It has intruded now, not obviously for all MPs because of this distance and travelling issue, but for a lot of MPs now, they are getting away on a Wednesday afternoon after PMQs or very early on a Thursday morning, and it's encroaching more into the parliamentary time. And we're also being told, picking up from MPs, that whereas once upon a time, they'd be able to sort of preserve that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and possibly Thursdays for parliamentary activity, and there were no expectations at the local level that they'd be in their constituency, now because of Zoom, as a result of the pandemic and the sort of the virtual parliament, expectations have changed. So MPs are finding that when they normally be in their Westminster office on a Wednesday morning, waiting for Prime Minister's questions to go into the chamber, the local organisation, whether it's a school or a hospital trust, just a group of constituents, maybe a housing association, wants to speak to them about an issue, and there's a sort of expectation that they will be available. Even if they're in Westminster, well, you can get online, here's the link.
And it's the MP's equivalent of the curse of email that, your boss is expecting you to respond to emails at sort of 9 o'clock at night when you're trying to have dinner or wind down watching the telly. Instead, you've got to be pinging back emails to your boss. This is the parliamentary sort of upscaling of that issue. Yeah,
so, you're seeing this real clash in terms of priorities and use of time between the local and the national. And I think there's no doubt that we've seen a trend over many years where MPs are much more focused on the local, and that has been accelerated.
I think it's particularly a result of the pandemic. It's not just the Zoom thing, it's the fact that when there were the lockdowns, members of Parliament found themselves having to explain the rules to people in their constituency who wanted to know, do the rules let me do this? And they were almost the only people who could get an answer. The local institutions that you might otherwise have turned to just didn't know any more than the MP. The MP could at least go and ask a minister or get a rapid response out of a minister on things like that. And so the role kind of escalated during that crisis. And again, when, for example, there was the great pullout of Afghanistan, a lot of MPs found themselves absolutely deluged with queries from people who had relatives in Afghanistan and who wanted to get them out, which might have been aid workers, they might have been Afghans with relatives in that MP's constituency. But the amount of constituency work that suddenly mushroomed out of nowhere because of that particular crisis was absolutely enormous for at least a quite considerable group of MPs.
Yeah, and now when you think about the economic crisis, the energy crisis, it's affecting not just the residents within their communities, but also business. So you're dealing with, the concerns of the local business that's struggling with business rates or is struggling to pay their electricity and energy bills. And they're wanting answers about how are we going to fix this problem because my business is at risk of going under. And what you tend to find as an MP, I experienced this myself because I worked for an MP, albeit quite a number of years ago now, is that MPs are the kind of the final resort. Everything else has failed. I can't get anywhere. I can't get any satisfaction. I can't get anybody to answer my questions. I'm banging my head against a brick wall. The MP and the advice surgery or writing to them, ringing their office is what we do in desperation. And very often it's almost too late for the MPs to be able to resolve the issue and sort anything out in the time that's left. And usually there aren't very many good answers left for MPs at that stage because, avenues have been exhausted.
You're kind of the ombudsman of last resort. I mean, a lot of the smart MPs will try and have local councillors at their constituency surgery who might be able to help with a specific problem about planning or housing or whatever it is, that they can immediately get someone to talk to because this is the person there. But the person that MPs absolutely hate is the one who says, I'm not going to bother with the council. I'm going to go straight to the top. As if the MP's somehow at the top of some hierarchy and can give orders to a local councillor.
But also the value of that depends on the local politics. So if you are a Labour MP in an area with a Conservative council...
Or vice versa.
You're not going to get that kind of help necessarily, and you're certainly not going to want the councillor from the opposition party in your advice surgery. So, it's contextual dependent. Depends on what's happening and what the political situation is in that constituency. And also we find within parties that, that there isn't necessarily always a strong relationship between the MP and the councillors, because quite often what the MP's raising, the issues and problems, if it is the same party that's running the local authority, you're basically being quite critical of what they're doing, because you're having to raise these problems all the time and, bang on the door of the chief executive of the council, bang on the leader of the council and say, can you please sort this out?
Well, absolutely. But, the MP can sometimes have very close links to people who can help. Can they text the manager of the local hospital to say, my constituent's waiting for something, it hasn't happened yet, can you get them an appointment? Those kind of things MPs can do. The other point about this is that it can be very, very valuable in the sense of being kind of good for the MP's soul, even if it's an awful lot of work. Because unlike in other systems where parliamentarians are perhaps a bit more detached from a particular geographical area, these are people getting their noses rubbed in the daily problems and realities of their constituents. In America, it's possible to be a very, very senior Secretary of State or something and never actually have to meet the constituents. You jet from high-level meeting in Washington to international summit to symposium to COP to Davos or wherever it is, and never actually have to meet an ordinary person. The British equivalents have to spend regular Friday afternoons in a damp church hall somewhere listening to people's housing problems, immigration problems, whatever it is, and know what really concerns them. And it's not necessarily the great sort of mega public policy issues that they'd like to sink their teeth into. It's the very mundane that concerns the people that they serve and who elect them.
Yeah, but sometimes you can find the worlds of the minister and the local MP clash. I mean, I remember... the MP that I worked for, he was a Foreign Office minister, and it was not unknown for us to be sitting in the advice surgery in the constituency, 6:00 on a Friday evening, and for me having to be working with his private office staff in the Foreign Office to set up a private phone call in the advice surgery so that he could go off into another room to take a phone call with one of the defence ministers in the United States at the Pentagon to talk about basically, more often than not, problems in Afghanistan that they were having to resolve, and he'd have to step outside the advice surgery while everybody else outside was waiting with their complaints about, the local, I can't get my appointment with my GP, or, one sort of problem was often potholes. I mean, that is, a huge issue for local MPs, getting constituents coming through the door complaining about that. And, that juxtaposition of a major national issue, international issue, and the most local and mundane you could possibly imagine. And, within seconds, they were having to turn from one to the other. The defence minister on the other end of the phone wasn't to know where he was in the constituency. And the defence minister in the US would be in his nice plush office in the Pentagon just outside Washington with a flag behind him, huge staff. And our minister was sort of sat in this sort of dingy, advice centre. With his local Westminster staff sitting in, trying to plug the phones in the right way.
But there's also the question of how much influence do individual MPs have and how do they use it? And I suppose the thing that a Member of Parliament has, whichever party they're in, is that they do have a bit of access to government ministers where there's some problem. I mean, the classic example is, buttonholing a Home Office minister about an immigration issue, for example. Once upon a time, MPs even had an almost sort of statutory right to stop someone being deported while their case was reconsidered. I think that ship sailed quite a while ago now, but it used to be the case. So that's where I think the prime influence lies for a Member of Parliament, is that they can whisper into the shell-like ears of ministers, often while they're going through their incredibly extended voting process where it takes 20 minutes for MPs to file through a division lobby.
Well, this is why when, the issue of electronic voting and, should we still have MPs walking through the lobbies to register their vote in person, taking 20 minutes to do so, Would it not be more effective, more efficient to have electronic voting, like they do in lots of other parliaments? And the answer comes back from a lot of MPs is no, and that's the reason. They want that opportunity in the lobby to be able to sidle up to a minister and make their case, make their point, possibly get a commitment to have a meeting, be put in touch with a civil servant who can help them answer a policy question, whatever it may be. But that personal contact direct with the minister is what they want to preserve. And it is an unusual part of the system that is not a feature of many other parliaments.
Absolutely. If they all just had to swipe a card or turn a key or something to express their vote, they just wouldn't have that chance to buttonhole a minister. And it matters more than people might imagine. I mean, of course, there are other formal ways you can make a point. You can have an adjournment debate at the end of the day where you want to look about the planning issues in your local high street or access to your local A&E or whatever it is. You can have a Westminster Hall debate on a similar subject. You can get a group of MPs together to raise a generic subject. So there are all sorts of ways that MPs can make a point. But the person-to-person one seems to me usually the most important, informally, below the radar, but nonetheless important for that.
Yeah, and that ability also to be able to say to your constituents, I've spoken to the minister. I've had that personal face-to-face contact. It also matters, of course, for party management purposes. The ability, you always hear this sort of the minister who's in trouble has been seen in the tea room in Westminster, out, meeting the backbenchers, trying to, soothe relations over whatever problem that they've got that week. And that personal contact, a lot of what happens in politics and in Parliament that is really essential and valuable to keep the wheels moving, to sort of grease the wheels, is what happens off stage, in the private, behind the scenes bits of work that we don't see. Unless, of course, you're a journalist like you, Martin. You're sat in Portcullis House cafe, collaring them as they walk past.
As they go past. But what we're not talking about here, and listeners will notice this, is we're not talking about individual MPs having a vast amount of leverage over laws that are passed on a day-to-day basis. The way you get leverage over that is either the government majority is so small that the individuals really do have a lot of traction, or alternatively, if a group of like-minded MPs can get together and say, up with this we will not put, you've got to make changes, ministers. But most of the time, MPs are, I'm afraid, lobby fodder. They are marched through the lobbies on the orders of their party whips, often for stuff that they don't really know about and haven't even read.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as true today as it used to be. I mean, you can go back, again, I'm quoting the work of Professor Philip Cowley at Queen Mary, who's studied sort of backbench rebellions. But you can go back to the 1950s and find whole sessions of Parliament where there were no government backbench rebellions. That's very rare these days in a session. But yeah, it's difficult to get a sufficient number of MPs together on an issue if a government has a majority. Because, first of all, they're signed up, they are party representatives. The whip, it is a form of discipline. And as you say, there are consequences that flow from it if you lose the whip. Mm-hmm. There are consequences that will flow even if you don't lose the whip. The pressure will be applied.
The whip can be cracked, to coin a phrase. Yeah.
But also, the politicians recognise that they're also dependent upon the party, for example, for support if they're in a marginal constituency. It works both ways. Loyalty, is a two-way street. But yeah, there is no doubt that there is a real concern amongst many sort of observers like us of Westminster that the legislative role of parliamentarians in the House of Commons is being abrogated, frankly.
Yeah, it's not as big as it ought to be on most things. Occasionally, when there's a really hot topic, which perhaps has concerns that cross party lines, you can occasionally get stuff done as a backbencher that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But it is quite a rare occasion. And in some ways, the role of a backbench rank-and-file MP who's not particularly earmarked for future glory as a cabinet minister or something like that is a pretty low-profile, almost demeaning one.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I think looking ahead to the general election and the new cohort of MPs that will be coming in. And it's, we don't yet know what the final number will be, but already based on the number of MPs who've announced that they are stepping down, it's going to be a significant level of churn.
That's before you start factoring in seats changing hands.
Yeah, look at the polls. And one of the things that time and again you find amongst a new group of MPs who come in after a general election is how they struggle to find their feet in those early months. It's a very, very unusual and different environment. And, the pressures are piling in to be up and running immediately. Some of them, they might never have really ever looked at a bill.
Yeah.
Piece of legislation. They wouldn't know, a statutory instrument. What is it? They haven't.
Came up and bit them.
Yeah, they don't know what the estimates process is. So there's the procedural and sort of technical side of scrutiny that they're going to have to learn. And Westminster is sometimes, it's another language. It does not make its rules, the processes, as accessible and as easy to understand, not just for the public, but for its own people.
It's another language, it's also another country. I mean, if you're an MP whose constituency is some distance away, you may be operating there for several nights a week on your own without your family and friends. You'll have to make new social connections. You'll have to try and find ways of staying out of trouble, frankly, as well. Make sure that you're gainfully employed during that period and you're using the time effectively. And it can be a very alienating and very lonely environment for someone who doesn't perhaps quite fit in.
Yeah, I mean, we found we did some research amongst the new cohort of MPs after the 2005 election and then after the 2010 election, and we sort of surveyed them at different points in time after they'd got elected in a study that was called A Year in the Life from a member of the public to member of parliament. And it tracked a lot of different aspects of their lives. But one of the things that came out of it was how quickly they were alienated, how, frankly, some of them were, saying it after 3 months, what are you most looking forward to? Finishing. What are you most looking forward to? The Christmas break, because I want away from here. And I think that's going to be a concern. If the parties, particularly assuming the Labour Party wins the election based on the polls, they could have quite a significant number of new members. I think they need to think very carefully about how they're going to manage the induction and the orientation programme for new members. And organisations like ourselves, the Constitution Unit, the Institute for Government and others can help and assist with that. But they need to give some really careful thought to what support they're going to put in place as parties, what, mentoring, sort of almost like buddying systems between older hands, MPs who've got a lot of experience who can help them, and try and get them over those first few months. Because as you say, often, and we found this after the 1997 election, we found it after the 2010 election, you have a big churn, a lot of new MPs coming in. There will be some who sink and there will be some who swim, and they need to find ways to manage those who are at risk of sinking. I mean,
one suggestion is give them something interesting to do, give them something that feels like it's a role. This is where perhaps places on the select committee system can come into play, because those can be fantastically interesting if you can get a place on a select committee that you particularly want to be on. I mean, it can also be that you're sent off into the salt mines a bit by the whip. So there was a point a couple of parliaments ago where any Conservative MP who had even a vague Scottish connection was being drafted onto the Scottish Select Committee because there weren't any Conservative seats in Scotland at the time. So if you had a muck in your name, off you went more or less regardless. But
the HS2 bill is gone, so you're not going to get put onto that.
The HS2 bill committees are seen as a kind of parliamentary gulag for the worst offenders as well. But there are useful and very, very interesting things that can be done on select committees, although the competition for places, because they have to be elected from within party groups to get onto select committees, can in the really top ones, foreign affairs or defence, for example, can be pretty serious competition. Yeah,
I mean the advice that an MP that I spoke to about this said best advice he would give to a new member is to think about a couple of issues that really matter in your constituency that you care about and that you want to try and fix, and a couple of matters at the sort of national level and that you are interested in and care passionately about. And if you can get a link between the two, all the better. But find an area, a niche for yourself that you can focus on, can concentrate on, can get some expertise in, and it'll give you a purpose in Parliament.
Absolutely, and if you do speak on a constituency matter in Parliament, it can get picked up, which is why you endlessly see at Prime Minister's Question Time people suddenly asking the Prime Minister about some particular very niche constituency matter. People do notice that, and it does get picked up and noticed in the constituency and covered in the local media, if there still is any local media in the constituency.
Yeah, which is a declining issue.
So.
Which brings us to Mark, to one of the sort of areas of questions and comments that came in. Is a couple of weeks ago the political editor of ITV, Robert Peston, he basically puts out some ideas and proposals about how he thought Parliament should be reformed, and key to it was, he thought, dealing with the role of the MP. And he proposed that we should get rid of 2/3 of them, pay them £250,000 a year, transfer a lot of the constituency responsibilities to an elected House of Lords. And he thought that this was a potential solution to some of our problems. And it seemed to me, I'd welcome your thoughts on this, because it seemed to me that for somebody who'd spent quite a lot of time around politics and Parliament, that didn't really seem to grapple with the key issues and the key problems that surround the role of MPs.
I'm not quite sure what problem that is the solution to.
No.
I saw that and I was a little bit baffled by it. When they contemplated at one point under the coalition cutting the number of MPs from 650 to 600, they then did a sort of cookie-cutter exercise to redraw constituency boundaries so they were all a little bit bigger. And what you found was that MPs would suddenly be dealing, in practical terms, with many more local authorities than they were before. So when they were being asked to solve a housing problem, they'd have to have develop contacts with lots more local authorities, health boards, hospitals, or whatever it is, whenever some problem arose. And that was just a sort of ugly practical difficulty of making a relatively small cut. Now, if you're going to cut the number of MPs by 2/3, then they're going to have that problem times 10.
Yeah.
I would have thought. And I'm not quite sure how transferring constituency responsibilities to an elected House of Lords helps the thing. You could end up with people competing with each other in a probably unhelpful way. One of the great virtues of the House of Lords at the moment is that, unencumbered by constituency work, peers can focus on legislation far more than MPs can. Stick a load of constituency duties and then we're having to have surgeries, etc., onto the work of a peer. And I think that the quality of scrutiny for new laws would go down even below what it is at the moment. And that would not be a good thing.
No, and I mean, one of the arguments that Robert was making was that this is, partly to try and increase the competence of MPs. I mean, that's a very subjective thing. I don't think the salary, I mean, my sense is that the salary is not a barrier to candidates.
If you're doing it for the salary, you're doing it for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
However much you paid, and there will always be people who would be fabulous MPs who decide they can't afford to do it.
Yeah, but also most people that I've ever spoken to who've thought about going into Parliament or standing for selection and haven't gone ahead with it, it's nobody's ever said to me that the salary was the problem. It's the lifestyle. It's the split lifestyle with your family in one place.
Split lifestyle. It's being eviscerated on social media.
It's the harassment. Yeah.
And also what we've been talking about earlier, the humdrum nature of the job when you hear the kind of treadmill of political life in Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, I was told in 2010 by a female MP who became a cabinet minister a few years later, but in her first few months in Parliament in 2010, she said that the biggest shock to her was loss of control of her diary. She'd had a background in business, in banking, and she'd reached a level of seniority where she had control over her diary and she had control over her own personal time. And the biggest problem was the lack of control once she got into Parliament, because she was at the mercy of the whip, the announcement of business every couple of weeks, not much in advance, and you couldn't plan for anything. And she couldn't decide herself what she would spend her time on.
Well, that's quite an interesting exploration of what MPs actually do. Plenty is the answer, but not necessarily the things you might accept. Hope you've enjoyed this.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thanks for listening to that. We hope you enjoyed that discussion. If you've got any more matters you'd like us to explain about things that go on in Parliament, why things happen in a certain way, why certain other things don't happen, you can send your questions to us at hansardsociety.org.uk/PMUQ.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/PM or find us on social media at Hansard Society.